Welcome back to Dark Radio.
Tonight, we descend into the shadows of a mind so twisted, so methodical, that even seasoned investigators were left speechless. This is not just another story of blood and cruelty. This is the tale of a man whose towering frame hid an even darker presence, a man who murdered not strangers in alleyways, but those closest to him, and later the innocent women who crossed his path.
His name is Edmund Kemper.
To the public, he seemed intelligent, articulate, almost harmless. To the victims, he was a monster disguised in plain sight. And to history, he will forever be remembered as the co-ed killer. But what drove a boy once locked away for killing his own grandparents to later become one of America's most terrifying serial murderers? What twisted logic allowed him to dismember, desecrate, and then calmly discuss his crimes with chilling precision? Tonight, we open the case file on Edmund Kemper, a man whose words still echo like a confession from the abyss.
Stay with us. The darkness is only beginning.
Edmund Emil Kemper III was born on December 18, 1948, in Burbank, California. From the very moment he came into this world, fate seemed to have scripted a tragedy. Edmund was never just another child. He grew up in a broken home where the shadows were not outside the window, but living inside the very walls around him. His father, Edmund Jr., a battle-hardened veteran of World War II, was a stern, detached man carrying the exhaustion of combat long after the war had ended. His mother, Clarnell, was sharp-tongued, domineering and merciless with her words. Their house was not a sanctuary of warmth, but a battleground of insults, shouting matches, and the kind of silence that weighs on a child like a curse. From early on, Edmund, tall, awkward, and out of place even as a boy, was made to feel like an outsider. He had two sisters, but instead of comfort, he often felt rejection. His mother repeatedly told him he was worthless, that no woman would ever love him, that he was destined to be a failure just like his father. The words cut deep, carving wounds that would never heal. And when Clarnell grew weary of his presence, she locked him away in the basement. It was a dim, musty chamber where spiders crawled in the corners and cold concrete pressed against his body as he lay awake at night, listening to footsteps above. For most children, basements were places of fear. For Edmund, it became a crucible of loneliness, resentment, and a growing fascination with darkness. Even as a child, the signs were there. While other children played with action figures or toy cars, Edmund ripped the heads off his sister's dolls. He didn't just break them, he dissected them. The head especially drew his obsession separated from the body, powerless, conquered. Years later, he would admit that these acts were his first attempts at mastering his own fears, but in truth, they were early glimpses of a disturbed psyche. Then came the animals. First, he buried his pet cat alive, later digging it up to examine the process of decay. Then he killed another family cat, slicing it open to satisfy his morbid curiosity about life and death. These were not childish pranks. These were escalating rituals, a pattern every expert would later recognize as a hallmark of a budding killer.
But no one around him cared enough to notice.
His mother, Clarnell, remained the harshest force in his life. She belittled him endlessly, told him he was monstrous, that women should fear him. She locked him in the basement not just as punishment, but as a way of protecting his sisters from him, as if planting the idea that he was already dangerous. Words have power. To Edmund, her words became prophecy. By adolescence, his body grew into something unnatural. By the time he was 15, he was already over 6 feet tall, towering above his peers. Eventually, he would grow into a giant, 6 feet 9 inches tall, weighing nearly 300 pounds. But the size that made him intimidating only deepened his isolation. He was awkward, clumsy, incapable of fitting in. At school, classmates kept their distance. At home, he was scorned. In his mind, rejection twisted into hatred. As his body grew, so did his imagination. Edmund later admitted that as a teenager, he fantasized about killing his mother. He daydreamed about control, over her, over women in general, over anyone who looked down on him. These fantasies were not fleeting thoughts. They were rehearsals, and in the solitude of the basement, they became his only source of comfort. When his parents divorced in 1963, the fragile pieces of his world collapsed. His father disappeared from his life. His mother, unable to manage him, sent him to live with his grandparents in the rural community of North Fork, California. But instead of healing, this environment only replicated the torment. His grandmother, Maud, was stern and domineering, much like Clarnell. She belittled Edmund, scolded him, and clashed with him constantly. To the boy, it felt like an endless cycle, one tormentor replacing another. On August 27, 1964, at the age of 15, the cycle snapped. In a fit of rage, Edmund grabbed his grandfather's rifle and shot Maud dead in the kitchen. When his grandfather returned home, Edmund shot him too, claiming later that he did it so his grandfather wouldn't have to see what happened to his wife. The justification was hollow. What mattered was that Edmund had killed for the first time, and in that moment, the monster inside him finally had a voice. But Edmund didn't run. He didn't hide. He calmly called his mother and confessed. Soon, police swarmed the scene. The prophecy Clarnell had spoken for years, that her son was dangerous, had been fulfilled. Kemper was placed in the California Youth Authority and later transferred to Atascadero State Hospital, a secure psychiatric facility for the criminally insane. There, doctors quickly discovered his staggering IQ, 145, on par with geniuses. His brilliance was not matched with empathy. Instead, it gave him tools, manipulation, deception, and a frightening ability to mimic remorse. Inside Atascadero, Edmund became a model patient. He studied psychology, absorbed the language of mental illness, and learned exactly what doctors wanted to hear. He even assisted staff in testing other patients, gaining insights into how psychiatrists evaluated dangerous behavior. He understood the system from the inside out. And when the time came, he used that knowledge to set himself free. By age 21, doctors declared him rehabilitated. He was released back into the world in 1969. But outside those walls, no one realized what had just happened. The state had released not just a murderer, but a highly intelligent predator, freshly educated in the science of deception. He wasn't cured. He was perfected. And as the gates opened, the towering figure of Edmund Kemper walked free. His grandparents had been only the beginning. The real nightmare was still waiting. When Edmund Kemper walked out of Atascadero in 1969, he appeared to be a reformed young man. To the psychiatrist, he was polite, intelligent, and stable. To the parole board, he was a shining example of rehabilitation. But what they didn't see was the cold calculation behind his calm demeanor. He had learned to mimic sanity, to wear a mask that could fool anyone. And behind that mask, the rage had only grown deeper. Upon release, Kemper returned to live with his mother Clarnell in Santa Cruz, California. Fate had dealt him no better hand. Instead of freedom, he walked back into the prison of his childhood. The relationship between Edmund and Clarnell was as toxic as ever, suffocating, volatile, filled with the same venomous insults and humiliations that had shaped him as a boy. She berated him constantly, telling him he was worthless, too awkward, too monstrous to ever find a woman. For Edmund, this was like pouring gasoline onto a smoldering fire. His fantasies of domination and violence grew sharper, more specific. He longed for control over women, control that had been denied him his entire life. And so, he began to plan. In 1972, Kemper bought a car, a dull, ordinary yellow Ford Galaxy. To most, it was just a vehicle. To Edmund, it was a hunting tool. California's highways were filled with young women hitchhiking to and from college campuses, a cultural trend of the era, and Edmund, with his towering size and calm, polite voice, seemed trustworthy enough. To these women, he was just another ride. To him, they were prey. At first, Kemper practiced. He picked up hitchhikers and dropped them off safely, testing his ability to lure them into his car without raising suspicion. He rehearsed his lines, refined his demeanor, and learned the terrain of his hunting grounds. He called it his training phase, a chilling glimpse into his meticulous, methodical nature. But soon, practice was not enough. The fantasies demanded more. The monster inside him had waited too long. On May 7, 1972, Kemper picked up two Fresno State students, Marianne Pesci and Anita Lucchesa. They never made it home. Edmund drove them into the hills near Alameda, pulled out a gun, and brutally murdered them. He later dismembered their bodies, keeping parts as trophies and disposing of the remains like garbage.
To him, this was not just killing, it was the ultimate expression of power.
Only a few months later, on September 14, 1972, he picked up 15-year-old Aiko Ku, a high school dance student. She accepted his offer of a ride, unaware she was stepping into the clutches of a predator. Edmund strangled her, then carried her body home to his mother's house, where he committed unspeakable acts. The cycle was accelerating. Edmund Kemper's double life had begun. By day, he was the polite, awkward giant who lived with his mother, who chatted with local police officers at bars, who seemed harmless despite his size. By night, he was a hunter cruising California highways, looking for women who fit his fantasies. The most disturbing part was how easily he blended in. He befriended police officers in Santa Cruz, drinking with them, joking with them, even earning the nickname Big Ed. They had no idea they were laughing with a man who was secretly piling up bodies. But Edmund wasn't satisfied with just the killings. He wanted to relive the power again and again. He began keeping souvenirs, photographs, body parts, memories he could revisit whenever he wished. Each murder fed the hunger, but it also deepened his obsession. On January 7, 1973, he picked up Cindy Shell, an 18-year-old student. He shot her and later dismembered her body in his mother's bathtub. The image of this crime is haunting. Edmund, the hulking man, standing in the same house where he had once been locked in the basement, now cutting apart the body of an innocent girl.
For him, it was both revenge against his mother's control and a ritual of domination.
The murders continued. In February 1973, he killed 2 more students, Rosalind Thorpe and Alice Liu. He picked them up near the university, shot them, and then drove their bodies past the campus security gate. The guards waved them through, completely unaware of the horror concealed in the trunk. By this point, Edmund Kemper was spiraling out of control. Each murder was not just about killing. It was about enacting his fantasies of possession and control, about silencing the voice of his mother that had tormented him for so long. The women he killed were in his mind stand-ins for Clarnell. Each victim was another way of destroying her, over and over again. What made Kemper so chilling was not just the brutality of his crimes, but the calm precision with which he carried them out. He was not sloppy. He was careful, deliberate, calculating. He had learned from his time in Atascadero how to cover his tracks, how to manipulate appearances, how to wear the mask of sanity so convincingly that no one ever suspected him. Meanwhile, Santa Cruz was drowning in blood. The early 1970s saw a wave of serial killings that left the city branded as the murder capital of the world. Edmund Kemper was not the only predator hunting its streets, but he was among the deadliest. Still, Kemper's greatest crime had not yet occurred. For all the women he had hunted, the ultimate object of his rage was still alive, still upstairs in the house they shared. His mother, Clarnell, was the root of his hatred, the figure who had shaped his fantasies, the voice he could never silence. Every murder up to this point had been a rehearsal, and in Edmund's mind there was only one final act left to complete his story. By the spring of 1973, Edmund Kemper had already left behind a trail of victims. Each life stolen fed into the darkness that had consumed him since childhood. But in his twisted logic, all of it was only leading to one inevitable confrontation, the showdown with his mother, Clarnell. For Edmund, every hitchhiker he picked up, every body he mutilated was in some way a rehearsal. The rage he inflicted on strangers was, at its core, the rage he felt toward the woman who had tormented him since birth. And though he had killed many, he knew the cycle would never end until Clarnell was gone. Clarnell lived in an apartment near Cabrillo College in Santa Cruz. She worked at the university library, a respected professional to those who knew her. But behind closed doors, she continued her psychological assaults on Edmund, mocking him, berating him, telling him he was unworthy of love, a failure, a disappointment. At nearly 25 years old, Edmund remained in the same prison of insults that had defined his childhood. And with each cutting word, the fantasy of her death grew clearer in his mind. In April of 1973, the fantasy became reality. On the evening of April 20th, Edmund returned home to find Clarnell waiting. She had been out drinking, and as always, she had words ready to cut him down. "I suppose you're going to want to sit up all night and talk now," she said sarcastically before retreating to her bedroom. Edmund, towering in silence, stood in the shadows, her words echoing inside him. He knew then what he would do. In the early hours of April 21st, he entered her bedroom. She was asleep, vulnerable, unaware. He stood over her for a long moment, staring at the woman who had haunted him for so many years. Then, with a hammer in his massive hands, he struck. The blows landed hard, ending her life. But for Edmund, it wasn't enough. He slit her throat, decapitated her, and, in a grotesque ritual, defiled her remains. Later, he placed her head on a shelf and screamed at it for hours, hurling back every insult she had ever given him. He used her severed head as a dartboard, stabbing it with darts, unleashing years of rage and humiliation. To Kemper, this was not just murder, it was vengeance. The ultimate act of domination over the one person who had always controlled him. But Edmund was not done. Later that morning, Clarno's close friend Sarah Sally Halleck came over to the house. Kemper, fearing that his mother's absence would be noticed too quickly, decided to kill her as well. He strangled Sally, staging the scene to make it appear as though the two women had gone away on vacation together. For the first time, Edmund Kemper had killed not strangers, but the very source of his torment and the one person tied to her. And yet, instead of relief, he felt an unsettling emptiness. The rage that had driven him for so long was gone. What was left was silence. In the days following the murders, Edmund fled. He drove aimlessly eastward, out of California, his mind spiraling. Without his mother, there was no purpose. Without the fantasy, there was no fuel. He wandered for days, consumed not by fear of capture, but by an overwhelming sense of futility. Finally, on April 23rd, 1973, in Pueblo, Colorado, Edmund Kemper did something no one expected. He picked up the phone and called the police. Calmly, he confessed to killing his mother, her friend, and all the young women before them. The officer on the other end thought it was a prank. Kemper had to call back, insisting that he was telling the truth. Eventually, investigators traced the call and realized the horrifying reality. The man known to local police as Big Ed, their drinking buddy, was in fact a co-ed killer. When officers arrested him, Kemper went quietly. At 6 feet 9 inches tall, he could have resisted, but instead he submitted. It was almost as if he had been waiting for this moment. For years, he had hidden behind a mask of calm intelligence, fooling doctors, friends, and even the police. Now, with his mother gone and his hunger sated, there was nothing left to hide. In his confessions, Edmund was disturbingly articulate. He described the murders in cold clinical detail, as though he were narrating someone else's crimes. He explained how he lured women, how he killed them, how he dismembered their bodies. He admitted to keeping trophies, to defiling corpses, to replaying the murders in his mind. His intelligence made the horror even more chilling. He was not insane. He was fully aware, fully conscious, fully in control. When asked why he turned himself in, Edmund gave a simple answer. The original purpose was gone. It wasn't serving any physical or real emotional purpose. It was just a pure waste of time. Emotionally, I couldn't handle it any longer. I couldn't live with it. But beneath those words lay the darker truth. Edmund Kemper had achieved his ultimate fantasy. By killing his mother, he had silenced the voice that tormented him. The murders of others were stepping stones to that one final act. And once it was done, the game was over. Santa Cruz, already drowning in blood from multiple serial killers operating during the same era, was stunned. The friendly giant who had chatted with officers, who had seemed like a harmless local oddity, had in fact been one of the most prolific and disturbing murderers of his time. The trial that followed would reveal even more about the monster behind the mask. Doctors, investigators, and jurors alike would hear in chilling detail how Edmund Kemper turned fantasies into reality, how his towering size and sharp intelligence made him both predator and deceiver, and how the line between genius and madness is often thinner than we want to believe. And as the court prepared to pass judgment, one question lingered. What does society do with a man who embodies both intellect and monstrosity, who can articulate his crimes with perfect clarity yet feels no remorse for the lives he destroyed?
The answer would come soon enough.
The arrest of Edmund Emil Kemper III in April 1973 sent shockwaves through Santa Cruz and beyond. The city was already known as the murder capital of the world, haunted by multiple serial killers operating almost simultaneously. But the revelation that Big Ed, the affable giant who had shared beers with local police officers, was in fact a co-ed killer made the horror feel even more surreal. When Edmund turned himself in, he did not come across as the typical criminal. He wasn't trembling, incoherent, or resistant. Instead, he was calm, articulate, and eerily cooperative. Sitting in an interrogation room, he laid out his crimes with the detached precision of a scientist conducting an experiment. Investigators were struck not just by the brutality of his acts, but by the chilling intelligence with which he described them. He admitted to everything: the murders of 6 young female students, the dismemberment, the necrophilia, and the grotesque rituals he performed with the remains. He confessed to killing his mother and her friend, explaining in horrifying detail how he decapitated Carnal, screamed at her severed head, and mutilated her body. Nothing was hidden, nothing sugarcoated.
He wanted them to know it all.
What haunted investigators most was his composure. He spoke of the killings as though he were reading from a manual, devoid of panic or regret. One detective recalled later, "He told us things that would make a strong man vomit, but he told them like he was describing the weather." By May 1973, Edmund Kemper had been indicted on 8 counts of first-degree murder. His trial would become one of the most disturbing spectacles in California's criminal history. The defense considered an insanity plea. After all, how could a man commit such monstrous acts and not be insane? But psychiatrists who examined Kemper discovered something even more terrifying. He was not psychotic. He was not hallucinating, not delusional, not detached from reality. His IQ tested at 145, bordering on genius.
He understood exactly what he was doing.
Doctors described him as having a personality disorder, antisocial, narcissistic, and obsessed with domination. He wasn't insane. He was evil. In October 1973, his trial began. Standing at 6 feet 9 inches, weighing nearly 300 pounds, Kemper towered over everyone in the courtroom. He looked more like a lumbering giant than a defendant, but when he spoke, he was articulate, polite, even charming. This contradiction, monster in body, intellect in voice, captivated the public. Throughout the trial, he gave detailed testimony about his crimes, as if compelled to share every secret. He described luring the women into his car, the calm conversations he had with them before turning violent, the moment of killing, and the grisly acts afterward. He did not flinch, even when describing the most grotesque details. Jurors listened in stunned silence, many unable to look him in the eye. The prosecution painted him as a cold, calculating predator who used his intelligence as a weapon. They highlighted how he had studied psychology while incarcerated at Atascadero, how he had learned to manipulate doctors, how he had rehearsed his kills by picking up hitchhikers safely before eventually striking. Every detail showed premeditation, not madness. The defense argued that his actions, especially the murder of his mother, revealed a disturbed mind incapable of rational control. They claimed he was driven by compulsions born of trauma and abuse, that his childhood under Carnal's cruelty had worked him into something beyond comprehension. But Edmund himself undermined his defense. On the stand, he admitted he had planned, calculated, and executed his crimes deliberately. He acknowledged he understood right from wrong. He even described how he took care to avoid detection, disposing of bodies with precision and hiding evidence meticulously. These were not the acts of someone out of touch with reality. When asked why he killed, Edmund's answers were chilling. He spoke of needing to silence his mother's voice, of feeling rejected by women, of needing control over those who had power over him. "I was raging inside," he said calmly. "I had to get it out." The jurors deliberated for just 5 hours. On November 8, 1973, they returned their verdict, guilty on all counts. Edmund Kemper, the co-ed killer, was convicted of 8 counts of first-degree murder. When the judge asked him what sentence he believed he deserved, Edmund's response was unsettling in its simplicity: death. He told the court he felt he was unfit to live, that he deserved execution for his crimes. But at the time, California had placed a moratorium on the death penalty. execution was not an option. Instead, the judge sentenced him to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. Edmund Kemper was sent to California Medical Facility in Vacaville, where he would remain for the rest of his life. Behind prison walls, Kemper continued to display his contradictions. He was a model inmate, cooperative with guards, intelligent in conversation. He recorded audiobooks for the blind, his deep baritone voice narrating children's stories and novels, an irony so dark it bordered on grotesque. But to those who interviewed him, the mask never fully hid the monster beneath. In later interviews, he described his crimes with the same unnerving calm, reflecting not with remorse, but with curiosity. He spoke of how the murders gave him a sense of possession, how he reenacted the killings in his mind, how silencing his mother was the ultimate climax of his twisted story. For psychologists and criminologists, Edmund Kemper became a case study in evil. Intelligent, articulate, fully aware, yet devoid of empathy. He was not the frenzied maniac society often imagines when thinking of serial killers. He was proof that monstrosity can wear the face of normality, that evil can be polite, articulate, even charming. The trial may have ended, but the questions lingered. How many signs had been missed? Could anyone have intervened earlier, when he killed animals as a boy, when he murdered his grandparents at 15, when doctors at Atascadero declared him rehabilitated? Or was Edmund Kemper's descent inevitable, the product of forces too dark to contain? In the end, justice had confined him, but the specter of his crimes would never leave Santa Cruz, nor the nation that came to know him as the co-ed killer. Yet for all the answers his confessions provided, the greatest mystery remained unsolved. How could a man so intelligent, so aware of right and wrong, choose again and again to descend into the abyss of blood and shadows? That chilling question would continue to haunt the world long after the gavel fell. Prison walls became the permanent backdrop of Edmund Kemper's life after 1973. Sentenced to life without parole, the 6'9" giant known as the co-ed killer was locked away in California's Vacaville Medical Facility, a place designed not just to punish but also to study. For psychologists, Kemper was more than a murderer. He was a living specimen, a mind to be dissected, a riddle to be solved. What made Edmund stand apart was not just the scale of his crimes, but the way he spoke about them. He was articulate, reflective, disturbingly rational. Unlike many killers who retreat into silence, denial, or delusion, Kemper welcomed the chance to explain himself, and in that willingness he became both a window and a warning. Behind bars, he adjusted quickly to the routines of prison life. Guards found him compliant, polite, even helpful. Unlike the violent outbursts that many inmates displayed, Edmund was calm. He followed rules, worked with staff, and even volunteered for projects. This cooperation earned him privileges, but it also lulled some into forgetting what he really was. One of his most unusual contributions was his work recording audiobooks for the blind. Using his deep, resonant baritone, Kemper read hundreds of books, children's stories, novels, educational materials. His voice, which once lured victims into his car, now became the voice that comforted strangers who would never know the man behind it. To many, this irony was grotesque. The same man who silenced women forever was now giving voice to literature for the vulnerable. But psychologists and criminologists were far less interested in his narrations than in his mind. The 1970s and 1980s saw a growing fascination with the psychology of serial killers. The FBI's Behavioral Science Unit, in its early days of criminal profiling, turned to Kemper for insights. Agents Robert Ressler and John Douglas, pioneers of criminal profiling, interviewed him extensively. Kemper did not hold back. He explained his methods, his fantasies, his compulsions with chilling clarity. He described how he rehearsed by picking up hitchhikers before killing, how he sought control by keeping souvenirs, how murdering his mother was the culmination of years of rage. What the FBI found in him was a paradox, a man who could describe the horror of his crimes with perfect logic, who understood morality yet deliberately chose to ignore it. He became, unintentionally, a cornerstone in the development of modern criminal profiling. His interviews helped agents understand patterns of behavior, psychological triggers, and the chilling capacity for manipulation in intelligent offenders. Yet even as he offered insights, Kemper revealed the void at his core. He admitted that the murders gave him a fleeting sense of satisfaction, but no lasting fulfillment. He confessed that afterward he was left empty, disgusted. searching for the next high. His words painted a picture not of a man possessed by uncontrollable madness, but of a predator who knowingly fed his urges at the cost of human lives. In interviews, Edmund often returned to the subject of his mother. He described her as the root of his hatred, the voice that never ceased, the humiliation that carved itself into his soul. His killings of the co-eds were, in his own words, practice runs for killing her. And when that final act was done, his purpose evaporated. What disturbed psychologists most was his self-awareness. He was not delusional about his crimes. He admitted he enjoyed aspects of them, admitted he planned them, admitted he knew society would consider him evil. In many ways, Edmund was more terrifying than killers who claim insanity. He represented the possibility of a man fully conscious, fully intelligent, and fully evil. As years passed, he remained a cooperative prisoner. He gave interviews, spoke to students, and became a case study in countless criminology courses. Some who met him were struck by his politeness, his calm demeanor, his almost avuncular presence. They had to remind themselves that the gentle giant sitting before them had decapitated his own mother and turned her head into a grotesque dartboard. In later decades, documentaries and true crime programs sought him out. Each time he gave long, measured answers, often with unsettling honesty. He spoke of the feeling of power when a victim's life slipped away, of the dark satisfaction in controlling another human being completely. He did not flinch when recalling the most graphic details, and though he sometimes expressed what sounded like remorse, it often came across as intellectual rather than emotional, an acknowledgement of wrongdoing rather than genuine sorrow. To criminologists, Kemper's case raised profound questions. Was he the product of abuse shaped by an unrelenting mother who humiliated him until he snapped? Or was he inherently monstrous, using his childhood as a convenient justification for urges that would have surfaced regardless? The debate continues to this day, with some arguing that environment pushed him over the edge, and others insisting his choices defined him. Life in prison did not strip him of his capacity to influence. Fellow inmates reportedly respected him for his size and intelligence. He avoided fights, preferring conversation and compliance. He became something of a fixture, a permanent presence as the decades rolled on. But the darkness never left him. Even in his later years, Edmund admitted he still thought about killing. He claimed he had learned to control those urges behind bars, but his words left lingering doubt. Could a man so steeped in blood ever truly change? Or did the cage merely contain the monster, leaving it to rot but never to vanish? In many ways, Kemper's prison life embodied the contradictions of his entire existence. He could be the cooperative inmate reading books to help others, while simultaneously being the remorseless killer who admitted to finding sexual satisfaction in mutilation. He could speak eloquently about morality, while embodying its opposite. For the world outside the prison walls, his story became one of the most infamous in true crime history. The co-ed killer's name joined the ranks of America's most notorious serial murderers, Bundy, Dahmer, Gacy. But unlike many, Kemper was not caught by clever detective work or forensic breakthroughs. He turned himself in, not out of guilt, but because his mission was complete. And that is perhaps the most chilling aspect of all. He stopped not because anyone forced him to, not because the police closed in, but because he chose to. His life and crimes were an exercise in control from beginning to end. Decades after his conviction, Kemper remained behind bars, growing old, yet still lucid, still articulate, still willing to explain himself to anyone who asked. He was and remains a living monument to the darkest recesses of the human psyche, a reminder that intelligence does not preclude evil, and that sometimes the most polite smile can hide the most monstrous intent. But Edmund's story was not yet finished. In his later years, his health would decline, yet he would continue to cast a shadow across criminology, media, and culture. His interviews, his recordings, his very presence became artifacts of horror, tools for understanding, warnings for the future. And as the decades passed, one question remained unanswered. Had the world truly learned from Edmund Kemper, or had it merely stared into his abyss and recoiled, too afraid to see its own reflection staring back? Time is the one judge no criminal can escape. Decades after Edmund Emil Kemper III walked into that phone booth in Colorado and confessed to a trail of blood and horror, he remains locked away, an aged man whose body is weakened but whose story still looms large in the collective imagination. As the years passed, Kemper became less a man and more a symbol, a living specimen of evil in captivity. For criminologists, he was an open book, a man who spoke not in riddles or denials but in clear clinical detail about the darkness that drove him. For the public, he was a chilling curiosity, the polite giant whose voice once narrated audiobooks, yet whose hands once strangled life from young women. And for survivors, families of victims, and anyone who studied him closely, he was a reminder of just how thin the line is between normalcy and monstrosity. Edmund Kemper lived through a cultural transformation. In the decades following his conviction, serial killers became grim figures of fascination in American media. The 1980s and 1990s saw an explosion of true crime coverage. Books, documentaries, films. Kemper's case stood alongside those of Bundy, Gacy, and Dahmer as one of the darkest examples of human depravity. But unlike some killers who relished public attention, Kemper was paradoxical. He granted interviews, sometimes eagerly, yet often expressed disdain for the way his story was sensationalized. He spoke as though he were a teacher, providing lessons for investigators and criminologists, while at the same time recounting details so grotesque that they cemented his place in the pantheon of infamy. Television series, documentaries, and books repeatedly returned to his story. Perhaps the most striking portrayal came in modern culture when Kemper was depicted in the Netflix series Mindhunter. The actor Cameron Britton's chillingly accurate performance brought Edmund's eerie calm and articulate explanations to a new generation, sparking renewed fascination and dread. The real Kemper, by then decades into his sentence, reportedly knew about his portrayal. The idea that a man who once lured women into his car had become a character studied and dramatized for entertainment was a grim testament to how his crimes had fused with culture. But there were deeper questions that lingered, questions of ethics. Should Kemper's voice, his interviews, his explanations be broadcast, analyzed, dissected, even admired for their clarity? Was there not a danger in allowing him to have a platform, even from behind bars? Some argued that his cooperation with law enforcement helped advance criminal profiling, possibly saving lives in the long run. Others countered that giving him attention gave him exactly what he always sought: control, influence, power, even if only in words. Inside prison, Kemper's health began to deteriorate as he aged. Diabetes, heart problems, and declining mobility turned the towering killer into a frail shadow of his former self. Yet even in weakness, his legend grew. For journalists, students of criminology, and true crime enthusiasts, his case remained one of the most infamous of all time. What makes Edmund Kemper unforgettable is not just the brutality of his acts, but the contradictions he embodied. He was a man who could spend hours gently recording books for the blind, yet casually recount how he decapitated his mother and screamed at her severed head. He was a man of intelligence and insight, yet who chose to use his gifts to deceive, manipulate, and destroy. He was, in essence, the embodiment of the coexistence of brilliance and monstrosity. To many, his story forces an uncomfortable confrontation. Evil does not always look like chaos. It does not always wear the mask of madness. Sometimes, it looks like a man who shakes your hand, buys you a drink, and speaks with perfect politeness. Sometimes, it hides behind intelligence, charm, and reason. And sometimes, as in the case of Edmund Kemper, it grows so tall that it towers above everyone else, forcing us to look up and face it. The lessons of his story are not confined to criminology. They ripple outward, touching questions of justice, rehabilitation, and human nature. Could he have been stopped earlier? Could intervention in his violent childhood have changed the trajectory? Or was his path always destined to end in blood? We may never know. What we do know is this: Edmund Kemper is proof that monsters can be made, but also that monsters can choose. His mother may have fueled his rage, society may have overlooked warning signs, but in the end, Edmund chose to kill. Again and again, he chose. His awareness, his intelligence, his capacity for reflection strip away any easy excuses. And so Edmund Kemper remains one of the most unsettling killers in American history, not because he was insane, but because he wasn't. Not because he hid in shadows, but because he walked in daylight. Not because he was a mindless brute, but because he was articulate, intelligent, and fully conscious of every life he stole. For Dark Radio listeners, his story is not just a recounting of horrors past. It is a warning. Evil can hide in intellect. It can cloak itself in charm. It can sit beside you at a bar, laugh with you, speak kindly, and still be planning your death. Edmund Kemper's legacy is not one of fascination, but of fear. He reminds us that monsters are real, and sometimes they speak with the calmest voices of all. And as long as his story is told, the world will never forget the co-ed killer, the giant who turned his brilliance into brutality and whose darkness became a mirror for our own unease about the nature of evil. If the shadows of this story unsettled you, you're not alone. Evil often hides behind the most ordinary faces. Subscribe to Dark Radio for more real-life darkness brought into the light. And remember, justice may sleep, but it never dies.